I've noticed that people use stopping power to mean different things, and they don't really bother to define what they're talking about. Then you combine that with a sort of vague understanding of what is going on to begin with, and you have a situation where people are going to be perpetually arguing about a topic and talking past each other. So this is why I'm showing you one of the most useless statements on the subject that there is. This person essentially says that increasing velocity causes a strange increase in kinetic energy. Then he says that just looking at kinetic energy makes it look like the 9mm has more energy than the 45. Yes, you heard that right. But that is false to him because 45 caliber rounds have more stopping power. I'm not making fun of him because he is not good at articulating what he wants to say. I'm simply pointing out the fact that a major reason that this is a confused topic to begin with is because regular folks are not taking the time to adequately explain what they mean. Likewise, most people don't have a very complete view of the subject. Also, anyone who talks about stopping power without taking the time to clarify that it is not at all reliable with most handgun rounds immediately loses their credibility because they either do not understand the topic well enough to know that, or they are otherwise leaving out the most important part of the conversation. I also want to say that I almost never use the term stopping power because of the inherent confusion around the term. I much prefer the term hydrodynamic shock, or better yet, instant incapacitation from hydrodynamic shock, because it is a more accurate and descriptive term. Generally speaking, we have a problem of determining cause and effect, as well as adequately defining what stopping power is. Jeff Cooper made a distinction in saying that stopping power is different from killing power, and that whether or not an assailant is killed is irrelevant, but stopping them is what is important. I have read some of the books that he has written, and I have seen some of the talks that he's given, but I have not seen him give a good and detailed explanation of the mechanics behind stopping power versus killing power. Personally, I think he was pretty biased on the subject, and I know for a fact that he did not have the scientific information that is now available today that would have clarified some of the things. He analyzed various shootings and came up with the data that said 90% of the time, people who are shot with 45s are stopped. The problem with Jeff Cooper's numbers is that he didn't pay enough attention to what specifically caused the individuals to be stopped, which is why his numbers led to many people to believe that it was simply the caliber of the cartridge that causes immediate incapacitation. Back in 1987, the FBI's Wound Ballistic Workshop determined that with the exception of brain or spinal cord hits, reliable and reproducible immediate incapacitation of humans is a myth. So when the FBI decided to switch to 9mm a number of years ago, one author took issue with the FBI's statements about reliable stopping power from gunshot wounds being a myth. So he effectively said that while dropping an assailant dead with a single shot is highly improbable, stopping power means more than that and it includes faster incapacitation. To him, the FBI doesn't have enough evidence to back up this claim that stopping power is a myth with that definition. I view this specific argument as moving the goalposts. If we were talking about faster incapacitation, we would call it that instead of stopping power. The FBI did not say that faster incapacitation was a myth because that would be absurd. On the other side of the argument, handguns can actually cause someone to be stopped or immediately incapacitated, and that the FBI's blanket statement is actually wrong when they say handgun stopping power is simply a myth. An important side note is that one of the major reasons that the FBI switched to 9mm is because of the majority of their agents shot better with it. This actually tells us more about the skill of their agents than the 9mm cartridge itself. Likewise, they say also that 70 to 80% of the shots fired by law enforcement officers in shooting incidents miss the intended target. There is a huge difference between gunfighting and shooting at a paper target. Like I've said before, law enforcement officers qualify in a stress-free environment while shooting at paper, which obviously does not equate to being effective in real-world gunfights. Apparently, the FBI has a rather lax approach to training their agents, so if they are only bothering to teach their agents the basics, this would tell us that they are not taking things seriously enough. It would also explain why their agents are shooting much better than 9mm than .45 because they don't have enough training to handle a weapon with moderate recoil well. Back to the point, the key distinction to make is that while it is possible to immediately stop an animal with a handgun, it seems to not be possible to ensure reliable immediate incapacitation. Animals like deer can be immediately or effectively incapacitated, aka stopped, with a bullet that does not directly impact the central nervous system. Of all the handgun calibers, this seems to happen the most readily with the .500 Smith & Wesson for the obvious reason of its very high power and large bullet diameter. Now, I know what you're thinking, if some deer are stopped and others aren't, and since the .500 Smith & Wesson is the most powerful handgun in the world, I want you to ask yourself one question. Do you feel lucky? If you do feel lucky, then you would be willing to bet your life on the first shot being all that is needed to incapacitate a threat. If you don't feel lucky and you are not willing to bet your life on something that may or may not happen, you would choose a less powerful handgun like a .45 or a .357 Magnum, because that would not be so hard on your ears and that would allow you to make faster follow-up shots in key areas like the brain or pelvis if the first chest shot did not immediately work. If you don't believe instant stops can be achieved with handguns, I would recommend you watch my previous video on the subject of hydrostatic shock and hydraulic effects for more proof. The most recent attempt to quantify stopping power in relation with particular calibers was from Greg Elefritz. The results from his data is that the one-shot stop rate between calibers is not enough to make a statistically relevant difference. He makes the point that the majority of people who are shot simply give up because they don't want to be shot anymore. This could obviously explain why there is so little difference in the one-shot stop rate across calibers. Since being stopped in this context can be caused by both physical and psychological means, these numbers don't actually tell us how often we should expect that a living creature will be physically incapacitated by a given round. Certainly, the number of people who are immediately physically incapacitated would be much lower than the rates we are seeing here. Since I'm talking about stopping power, I feel obligated to mention Marshall and Sanow. They wrote a couple of books about stopping power, and they listed a bunch of statistics in their books for the one-shot stop rate of each ammunition and bullet type. However, if you're excluding events in which someone is shot more than once, then the results can't even be taken at face value because they are fundamentally flawed because of the amount of data that they have excluded. Secondly, they felt the need to say that the ammunition was tested on live animals in the so-called Strasbourg goat tests, and the results of these alleged tests mirrored their previous statistics. However, the Strasbourg tests clearly did not happen, and the report about the Strasbourg tests has glaring inconsistencies and issues that demonstrate this. So if Marshall and Sanow feel the need to fabricate an event to add further credibility to their statistics, that tells us a couple of things. First of all, that they inherently understand that their statistics are lacking credibility or believability to begin with. Second of all, that they are not above fabricating events in order to gain credibility, which makes me question whether their original statistics were actually based off of anything to begin with. What I find particularly bizarre is the fact that some people want to still believe in the Strasbourg goat tests even though they have been discredited. The only explanation that I can really give for this is that some people want answers badly enough that they are willing to lie to themselves to ease their cognitive dissonance. It is human nature to desire certainty, and unfortunately some people will look for certainty in the wrong places. Anyway, the Indianapolis Police Department used .357 Magnum 125 grain hollow point rounds going at around 1,400 feet per second, and the Illinois State Police used 115 grain plus P plus hollow points at roughly 1,300 feet per second. Both departments were extremely pleased with these rounds, and with the .357 Magnums, city officials said that there was never an effective return of fire from a felon hit with one of these rounds in the torso. The devil is in the details with such a statement. Nowhere was it explicitly mentioned that these felons were stopped with such rounds, And it also wasn't mentioned that we would have less favorable results with somewhat less powerful or damaging cartridges. A very interesting part of this quote is where it mentions the testing of the pig heart in ballistics gel. A bullet similar to the hot 9mm Illinois State Police load was shot near the heart, and the cavitation of the wound was actually enough to tear the aorta of the heart, even though the bullet did not actually touch it. The rule of thumb is generally that bullets going over 2,200 feet per second is enough to overcome the elasticity of the tissue and cause significantly more tearing of flesh instead of just what the bullet directly impacts. Since it's a rule of thumb, it should be no surprise that light and fast handgun bullets are capable of achieving the same thing at a somewhat smaller scale. However, we should not jump to the conclusion that bullets with high velocity and shallow penetration directly cause reliable stopping power. If we go back in time a bit, we can see that when the Illinois State Police first switched to 9mm handguns, they had an even lighter bullet at an even higher velocity. They assumed that high velocity and light bullets were more effective and had more shocking power. For those of you who don't know, shocking power, and similar terms were precursor terms used for what we now call stopping power. If high velocity and light bullets were in fact inherently better, then they would have no reason to switch to a slower and slightly less powerful round. There is a significant problem with people believing, without really solid evidence, that light and fast bullets are inherently better than slow and heavy ones, and the same is true for vice versa. It's making an assumption based on an overly simplified view of the world. One person who was in the Illinois State Police points out that the 95 grain Winchester jacketed soft point round was not used for long. He also says that they started using it only for a short time after the failure of the 115 grain Winchester Silvertip at the Joliet shooting. Presumably there was better ammunition available, since the 95 grain 9mm soft points have essentially been forgotten and replaced with heavier hollow points. I'm not 100% certain what happened at Joliet, but I do know that the original Silvertip rounds had major underexpansion and overpenetration problems. From what I can gather, it seems that the first incident in which the first generation Silvertips were used by the Illinois State Police, the assailant had to be shot quite a bit due to the fact that the rounds were having poor and inconsistent expansion, so I believe that this is what happened at Joliet. Likewise, overexpansion can also be a significant problem. We have had a case where 9mm failed to incapacitate an angry dog, and the same is true for 45s. In both cases, the hollow points had too much expansion and too little penetration. In comparison, a deeper penetrating .357 Magnum round actually achieved immediate incapacitation. Since we cannot count on the .357 Magnum or similar common handgun calibers to have stopping power when we need it, we can say that it is inherently more favorable to have a round that consistently has enough penetration to ensure lethal damage to the vitals. The reason that I have highlighted the word effect and physiological is because the editor made a mistake here. He should have caught that the words should be affect with an E and psychological. To say that an animal has no physiological aspects of defeat would be to say that it is basically invincible. In comparison, having no psychological aspects of defeat means that it takes physical incapacitation and not a psychological thing like fear to stop you from attacking further. And now for the $20 question. What is stopping power and what causes it? Since I've already covered the more scientific aspects of this in another video, it's not hard for me to point to the physiological causes. We know that fatal gunshot victims have small amounts of brain damage that cannot otherwise be explained, so it is unquestionable at this point that gunshot wounds from handguns is causing blood to be forced into the brain and is breaking blood vessels there. This effect is called hydrodynamic shock, and it is responsible for immediate incapacitation or death. Some would make the argument that the temporary cavity and stretching of tissue damages the spine, and this is what causes immediate death. I would say that this can cause incapacitation, but it is not the effect that causes immediate death. This is because a deer that was paralyzed in this manner would still have brain function and still would be able to move its body above the section of spine that was damaged. You may also shoot a deer in the chest, only to have it fall down and kick for a while. Technically speaking, the deer may not necessarily be incapacitated. If it had the motivation and understanding to do so, it may have the ability to get back up. The same applies to people, which is why we have two separate examples from body camera footage of people reanimating after they have gone down. This is an extremely important point. Going down does not necessarily mean that someone is incapacitated or stopped. It may mean that they lost blood pressure and went down, or it may mean that they gave up as soon as they got hit. So if a deer or an assailant gets shot and goes down, a casual observer of the incident may say that the person or animal was stopped, and while that is technically true, stopped does not necessarily mean incapacitated. Likewise, large animals like moose and elk can be extremely dangerous if you approach one without realizing it's not completely dead. Trying to cut the throat of such an animal while it is down but still alive puts you in a very vulnerable position. Take a tip from the African professional hunters and touch the end of your rifle barrel to the animal's eye. If there is no reaction whatsoever, then the animal is truly dead. Even a bullet that completely severs the heart from the surrounding body is not guaranteed to cause immediate incapacitation. Obviously, it takes time to bleed out, and until enough blood is gone to actually make a difference. A deer can go pretty far before it falls down and is actually incapacitated from such a wound. So where does this leave us? For most handgun calibers, I believe the rate at which animals and assailants are incapacitated or physically stopped with a non-CNS shot is not high enough that we should be extremely concerned about such a thing being somewhat more likely with one caliber versus another. We should definitely be more concerned about inflicting wounds in the vitals that ensure blood loss, or damaging things like the brain that can cause more immediate incapacitation. I, for one, am not going to bet my life on the stopping power of the average handgun round, and I would highly encourage you not to bet your life on such a thing either. So we should really be talking about the overall effectiveness of different handgun rounds, and not just stopping power. Handgun hunting is a good way to see how different rounds work in actual living animals, and it has the added advantage of increased range compared to self-defense distances. This increased range tells us what the limitations the bullet or caliber has, specifically the distance at which the bullet fails to have much expansion. Chuck Taylor used the .40 Smith & Wesson for hunting various animals, and says like other cartridges in the .40/41 caliber category, it has a narrow efficiency zone, aka the range of bullet weights that seem to give good overall performance. He says that most .40 Smith & Wesson jacketed hollow points expand in animals and people 60 to 70% of the time, like most other service cartridges. Bullets shot into animals at ranges over 30 meters have noticeably less expansion than bullets that impact at closer ranges. Mr. Taylor feels that the 200 grain rounds should be avoided because their weight prevents them from being used at decent velocities without increasing recoil to uncomfortable levels. In comparison, a light 135 grain jacketed hollow point has limited bearing surface, which prevents you from getting good accuracy. It also has bright muzzle flash and poor penetration. The 155 grain round at roughly 1,000 feet per second has moderate recoil, good accuracy, little muzzle flash, but only marginal penetration. Taylor concludes that the best jacketed hollow point has a 180 grain weight because it gives low recoil, excellent accuracy, little or no flash, and deep but not excessive penetration. The Winchester Black Talon, Speer Gold Dot, Hornady XTP, and Federal HydroShock in 180 grains are the best bullets in his opinion. However, there is a bit of a problem. When 40 Smith & Wesson hollow points impact heavy clothing or thick fur, the hollow point of the bullet gets filled and prevents any expansion from happening. For example, Taylor shot a Madero ram twice with a 40 Smith & Wesson Glock from a range of 50 meters. The entrance and exit wounds were the same diameter, so he searched for the bullets. When he found them, they were both on the ground roughly 15 meters away from where the ram was. He found that they were both unexpanded and the hollow points were packed with wool. You may be asking right now, how much does that really matter? Whether the bullets expanded or not, the result was the same and the ram was dead. While that is a very good point, given the choice between a bullet that expands or doesn't, I would choose the bullet that expands. An expanding bullet simply provides more room for error due to its larger wound. A friend of mine routinely takes deer with hard cast lead bullets with a handgun and with no problems whatsoever. Over-penetration concerns aside, if you do not feel comfortable with a specific handgun round's ability to reliably and efficiently kill a deer from close range, then I think it is illogical for you to count your life on that round's effectiveness on a similar sized assailant at the same distance. Various hollow points are available today that are designed to expand even after going through thick clothing, like 4 layers of denim. This is in addition to a very good extreme defender round that do not rely on expansion to inflict significant damage. There is also a very low-tech solution to this problem, and that is the jacketed soft point. Since the jacketed soft point solely relies on the impact force for expansion, there is no hollow point to be clogged by material. The obvious problem is that many handgun calibers do not have enough impact energy to cause good expansion. The chart I'm showing you is the results from a test made where different rounds were shot into a meat target made out of lamb ribs, meat scraps, and franks. Behind the target was pillows to catch any bullets that passed through. It's pretty interesting that this author and Paul Harrell independently came up with a similar sort of meat target concept to test ammunition on. The main difference here is that the author's meat target has only meat products in it. It's obviously not as consistent as gelatin, but we can say that it is at least made of meat. Anyway, the 9mm jacketed soft point load showed absolutely no expansion in this test. As far as I can tell, jacketed soft points only give really good expansion and work well in Magnum calibers like 357 Magnum, 41 Magnum, and 44 Magnum. When we look at Remington's website, the price per round for jacketed soft points in 44 are roughly $1.90 versus the hollow points that are roughly $2.65 per round. They are both from the same product line, by the way. Obviously, calibers like 45 are overall cheaper than 44 is, but my point is that 45s can't be used with soft points to reduce costs like a 44 can. It is an interesting point that some hollow points in 44 can over-penetrate and some soft points don't over-penetrate the 18-inch mark in ballistics gel. So a rule of thumb may actually not be helpful with different kinds of ammunition and different barrel lengths. That brings me to my next point. The reason why Paul Harrell uses a 38 Super instead of a 45 for hunting deer is because the 45 has low muzzle velocity to begin with. This means that at longer distances like 25 or 50 yards, the 45 has dropped below expansion threshold and acts essentially like a full metal jacket round at the distance. So Paul has gotten really good results with his 38 Super because it has good expansion even at longer ranges. Obviously this mirrors the points Chuck Taylor made about range. So for hunting with handguns, practically speaking, higher velocity rounds like 9mm and 38 Super are better than lower velocity rounds like 45 ACP due to their longer effective range at which expansion occurs at. This is an important point to make because some certain states prohibit the use of calibers like 9mm for hunting based on the theory that they are not effective enough compared to calibers like 45 ACP. I cannot stress this point enough, but people who write laws generally do not know much about guns, which is why we have arbitrary laws that are counterproductive. Anyway, calibers like 357 Magnum and 44 Magnum are even better for handgun hunting at longer ranges because of their greater velocity and energy. Masad Ayub has tested 45 ACP 185 grain Federal rounds in hogs from various barrel lengths. I believe he means the Federal Hydra-Shok, just to be clear. When this round was fired from a 5-inch barrel, it gave plenty of expansion. From a 4 1/4-inch barrel, it gave noticeably less expansion, and from a 3 1/2-inch barrel, it gave no expansion whatsoever. If the slower 230 grain bullets were tested as well, we would see that they require more barrel length to guarantee expansion than the lighter 185 grain rounds. Thankfully, there are many high-tech hollow points available now that do give better expansion at slower velocities for those folks that use short-barreled 45s. However, it is interesting to note that in one slaughterhouse test, the PMC Starfire outperformed all the other hollow points tested by a slight margin. The Starfire has been discontinued for a while. However, PMC has introduced the SFX bullet, which seems to be of the same design. The catch is that it's only available in 9mm. Even if it was available in other calibers, I would not choose the SFX over all other bullet designs because of one test in hogs that gave marginally better results. That's the sort of thing that could give slightly different test results from one day to the next due to subtle changes in naturally occurring variables. There are a few tests out there of both the SFX and the original Starfire round. It appears to me that the Starfire and possibly the SFX round as well are not great at giving reliable expansion due to a mismatch of bullet design and velocity. It seems that if you have enough velocity, the bullet will expand. I have a feeling that this is a major reason the SFX round has been introduced in a relatively high velocity caliber like 9mm. Because frankly speaking, lower velocity calibers like 380, 38, and 45 are more likely to give no expansion. From what I can see, it's probably a good round as long as you have a 9mm with a 4-inch or longer barrel, though I'm not sure whether or not it would do well when shot through 4 layers of denim. I want to be clear that the PMC Bronze is not the same as the PMC Starfire or SFX, by the way. We also have some results from Paul Harrell's 2 videos comparing the 5-inch long barrel versus the 6-inch long barrel with 45 ACP guns with his meat targets. At a distance of 5 yards, the 6-inch barrel had enough of an increase in velocity, about 25 feet per second, to make a difference with Remington UMC 230 grain jacketed hollow points. The 6-inch barrel gave expansion for most of the rounds, but the 5-inch barrel only gave expansion for 1 out of 5 rounds. Yet when he used 185 grain Hornady American Gunner rounds, both the 5 and 6-inch barrels gave moderate expansion even at 100 yards. I would say that there is very little difference between the rounds shot from the 5 and 6-inch barrel at that distance. Now, there was also an interesting thing that I noticed while watching more of Paul's videos. He mentioned how he has shot deer with the 9mm, and generally speaking, he would recommend not doing that. But if you had Extreme Defender rounds that do more damage, that may be a game changer. The point about telling people not to use 9mm for deer seemed a bit strange to me, because the 38 Super has very similar energy and bullet diameter compared to the 9mm. In one of his tests, we can see that with the Sig Sauer jacketed hollow points, the 38 Super has only about 44 foot-pounds of energy more than the regular 9mm did. Given his statement about the Extreme Defender round, it seems that his main concern is about the amount of damage that the 9mm does. I don't think that 44 foot-pounds or a similar amount of energy is really enough to make a significant difference between the two calibers. So from my perspective, the answer is probably that he did not eliminate all the variables in the comparison he did between the deer shot with the 9 and the 38 Super. This is a pretty good explanation because he was not hunting in a perfectly controlled laboratory conditions, so perhaps due to projectile construction or distance, the 9mm rounds he was using on deer may have done less damage. This is not in any way a criticism of Paul Harrell, rather it's my attempt to clarify what he has said because I believe his perspective and experience are valuable. I have a friend who I was talking about hydrodynamic shock to. He He was talking about how a 375 H&H had a fairly consistent instant kill rate on deer. This is in comparison to a 30-06 that gave him about a 50-50 chance of instant kills. I had a theory that a higher amount of ruptured blood vessels and bloodshot meat around the wound was connected to higher rates of instant death from the hydrodynamic shock breaking blood vessels in the animal's brain, and my friend's experience did in fact confirm this theory because the 375 H&H bloodshot zone was significantly larger than the 30-06 was. So as far as cause and effect goes, things are pretty clear from my perspective. Likewise, one of my subscribers uses a Hot 4570 hardcast load to kill bears, and he says that it drops all of them. I've also mentioned in another video that an interesting effect happens when you push a non-expanding bullet at higher velocities. At a certain point, the penetration actually decreases, and this causes more energy to be transferred into the target compared to if the bullet exited. So practically speaking, what does all of this mean? Even large animals like brown or grizzly bears can be instantly stopped with the right ammunition and caliber combination. In fact, if you use just an average caliber like .300 Savage or its ballistic brother, the .308, you can occasionally instantly drop a bear. Or in the lore situation that was printed in Outdoor Life, a bear was instantly killed with a very small wound to the heart. So it would seem that a large wound is not actually necessary to cause instant death, though it probably makes instant death significantly more likely. Of course, you should always expect to need to make follow-up shots because nothing in life is certain, especially when we are talking about angry bears that are determined on hurting you. Even if you're totally sure something is going to work, you always want to have a backup plan in place just in case it doesn't, which is why every dangerous game hunter should have someone who can back him up with a rifle, and that they should also both have handguns in case a rifle is broken or jams. Since a bullet that causes more bloodshot around the wound is more likely to cause hydrodynamic shock and damage the brain than a bullet that has less bloodshot, you could refer to the better bullet here as having more stopping power, even if not every animal is stopped with that bullet. The obvious problem, though, is that if you use a bullet that destroys and bloodshots a lot of meat, that kind of defeats the point of hunting for meat. As far as I know, there isn't really a good way of trying to preserve a lot of meat while also trying to get a high rate of instant incapacitation with a regular chest shot, which is why some of the hunters back in the olden days specifically avoided using expanding ammunition and used full metal jacket rounds because they left more meat intact. Further research into instant incapacitation brought me to some very interesting forum posts from Rich here, who is talking about which calibers drop deer more readily than others. One of the better rounds he was using was a 150 grain 30-06 Sierra Pro Hunter at 2,900 feet per second. Just to clarify, Rich is aiming for about 4 inches above the heart. He is not hitting anything in the central nervous system directly. Likewise, he hits the nail right on the head with his comment about the calibers that drop deer more readily involving a faster energy dump, possibly causing a spike in blood pressure to the brain. A more technical description of this would be that the bullet causes a pressure wave through fluid-filled tissue, and that some bullets create a sharper and higher pressure wave due to more fluid-filled tissue being pushed at once. So the bullet is indirectly damaging the central nervous system. The medical term for the section of the bloodshot tissue where blood vessels have been broken is called the extravasated area, in case you were wondering. What is very peculiar here is that he says that 13 out of 14 deer shot with a 158 grain XDP 357 Magnum from a rifle barrel at about 1900 feet per second are dropped right there. Generally speaking, when you have results that go against your expectations in a big way, and you cannot think of an adequate explanation for it, the thing that you want to do is more investigation and experimentation. So if we did some more testing and observation in a controlled environment, we could learn considerably more about what ammunition and caliber combinations best provide immediate incapacitation. We could also prove or disprove his claims about the effectiveness of the 357 Magnum round. Finally, I want to mention that some people wish to use the Taylor knockout factor to judge stopping power, and I think that is a really poor idea. It was intended to be used in relation to a bullet's effectiveness in stunning an elephant, and real-world experience has proven that it is not even useful for that, as I have talked about in my African game series of videos. Likewise, any other formulas that were written before people had a firm understanding of the science behind hydrodynamic shock are quite unhelpful. It is my opinion that the only formula that would actually be useful in predicting anything reliably would have to be made by a scientist who has experimented enough and gathered enough data to predict such a thing. This is not meant to downplay the observations from everyday folks, because such observations are obviously still interesting and useful. I'm Info Gunvault. I'm known for my articulate, detailed, and analytical approach. I dispel myths, talk about how you can avoid being attacked by angry bears, and I cover many gun-related topics. I've done a great deal of research for my videos, which is why I have hundreds of pages of notes and quotations. I'd like you to come along for the ride with me in my relentless pursuit of the truth.